Have you ever noticed those weird shapes on top of castle towers and walls? Find out why this super iconic element of castle design didn't actually look like what you're shown in documentaries, discover their forgotten features, and learn why video games lie to you. This is the full guide to medieval castle Crenellations. The iconic rectangular shapes found on top of medieval walls, towers and keeps are probably the most famous element of European castle architecture. They are called crenellations, and their design is a perfect example for the defensive ingenuity of historic fortifications. Their lower part consists of a waist-high wall, the so-called parapet, which stops you from falling down and provides some protection. The parapet is raised to man height in regular intervals along the wall. The raised parts are called merlons, while the gaps in between are referred to as crenelles. The merlons have to be high enough to cover a man entirely while standing up. Together, the parapet, the merlons and the crenelles form the traditional castle battlement, which is intended to protect any guards or defenders atop of the wall. Crenellations were designed to enable an active approach to defense. While a normal wall only provides passive resistance by blocking an attacker's path and covering the defenders inside, crenellated walls not only provide shelter for those behind them, but they also give the garrison a protected position from where they can fight off enemies. Their purpose is to shield defenders on the battlement from enemy projectiles, such as arrows, bolts, or in later periods, even gunfire. The merlons allow for effective cover, while the gaps in between them were used to shoot at an approaching enemy. If an attacker managed to get up close, the defenders could lean out and throw down heavy stones or pour hot liquids to fend off anyone trying to damage or scale the wall. For better vision and an increased angle of fire, the lower edge of the crenelle was sometimes sloped downwards. Crenellations could take many forms and sizes. The most common shape for merlons was a simple rectangle or square. To better protect the merlons from being damaged by rain and snow, they were often covered with angled capstones or simply slanted at the top. The design of crenellations varied throughout Europe depending on the region. In Spain, for example, pointy merlons used to be very popular, while in Scotland stepped merlons were common. Rounded merlons also existed, as well as a huge variety of decorative shapes that catered to the individual taste of the castle owner. One particularly interesting type were so-called swallowtail merlons. They are distinctly Italian in style and are present on a vast number of castles in the country, but they can also be found in other parts of Europe, especially Austria and Switzerland, but also on the famous wall of the Kremlin in Moscow. Their extravagant form is purely an aesthetic choice, but they are just as capable of serving their intended role as a defensive structure. While the classic shape of crenellations is an essential part of a castle's silhouette in popular imagination, real-life castles and fortifications can often differ in appearance. In some regions of Europe, especially those with colder climates, crenellations and battlements were frequently covered with roofs. They sheltered the guards from rain and snow during their monotonous patrols. This kept their bodies warm and their minds alarmed, which was especially important during long sieges. When firearms became increasingly popular, keeping the gunpowder dry was absolutely essential, so more and more crenellated battlements got fitted with a roof. They not only protected the defenders from the elements, but also from enemy arrows coming in from above. If the natural terrain allowed the enemies to have higher ground than the castle itself, roofs not only shielded the defenders from projectiles, but also concealed the movement of troops on the battlements from the eyes of the enemy. To increase their defensive value, crenellations were often fitted with additional features. In some regions, especially in England and Wales, it was very common to fit the merlons with arrow slits. This enabled the defenders to observe the area and shoot at enemies while staying fully behind cover. The regular crenelles could still be used for up-close defense, or when better vision and larger fields of fire were necessary. Another common feature were wooden shutters which closed the gaps between merlons when they were not in use. This allowed for much safer movement on the battlements when under attack. In times of siege, the shutters would only be opened briefly to take a shot at the enemy and immediately closed again. This provided much more protection compared to open crenelles and gave the defenders much more space to safely move and reload. They were usually hinged at the top, which meant that enemies close to the wall could be engaged, while the partially opened shutter still provided some protection from the front. In order to even further strengthen the battlements of the castle, wooden structures called hurden were pretty common in Germanic and French regions. They would usually take the form of an enclosed walkway or balcony mounted in front of the actual crenellations. The hurde would overhang the wall and feature holes in the floor, allowing the defenders to shoot straight down or throw rocks at the foot of the wall without exposing themselves to enemy projectiles. Additionally, they also featured regular arrow slits, which meant that the garrison could shoot at an approaching enemy while staying safe behind the thick wooden planks of the hurde. Since they were made of wood and therefore much easier to destroy than stone, hurden were usually employed in conjunction with regular crenellations. In case the wooden elements were destroyed by fire or bombardment, the defenders could still utilize the crenellations behind them. Most hurden were demolished or have rotten away, but the square holes once used for securing their support beams to the wall can often still be seen on castles. With the rise of gunpowder weapons, the era of crenellations slowly came to an end. Over the course of the 15th century, the use of firearms increased dramatically, and they became the most important weapon for both defenders and attackers. Even though early guns were still rather crude, they proved to be accurate enough to hit defenders on the battlements when they stepped between the merlons. In case they missed their human target and only hit the crenellations nearby, their projectiles could produce extremely dangerous lead and stone splinters. The combination of massed use of firearms and a much more deadly effect on target led to a change in military architecture. While crenellations were still being built in the late Middle Ages, more and more castle owners favored gun loops instead of crenelles, which provided much better protection for the defenders. Gun loops are small openings of various shapes that allow the defender to fire his gun from behind a wall without exposing himself to enemy fire. During the 16th century, many existing crenellated walls saw a phase of modernization, with their gaps being bricked up and replaced by much smaller openings and gun loops. By this time, crenellations were seen as obsolete, and the design was not considered for new defensive buildings anymore. For hundreds of years, crenellations were not only a symbol of military strength and defensibility, but also served as a visual representation of high social and economic status. Crenellated castles signify the nobleman's power over his lands, and the merlons of a city's extensive walls demonstrated its wealth and independence. So it's no surprise that crenellations continued to be built as a decorative and symbolic element on castles, palaces and residences even after they lost their military value. In German lands, the turn of the 15th to the 16th century saw a phase of romanticization of the now largely outdated medieval knight. This led to many castles and forts still being fitted with decorative crenellations as a nostalgic reference to medieval times, with the actual battlements now relying on gun loops for defense. These fake merlons are mostly a lot smaller in size than their functional counterparts, to give the building the impression of being much larger than it actually is. Crenellations remained popular decorations on palaces, grand manor houses and neo-Gothic mansions up until the 19th and 20th century, still being associated with status and power today. Those decorative merlons may be the reason why crenellations are often depicted completely wrong in modern movies and video games. Frequently, they are either way too low to effectively cover a defender standing behind them, or they are outright miniature in size. It's also a very common mistake to depict them with a low or non-existent parapet, completely exposing any defender stepping between the merlons. Others have weird shapes that make them impossible to actually use in the case of a siege, or just turn them into some kind of handrail for the guards. So next time you see a castle in media, make sure to question the feasibility of its crenellation design. But after watching this video, You of course know how to identify fake or unusable Merlons and won't be fooled by media and the lack of historical accuracy ever again. Thank you for watching the first video of my upcoming Castle Guide series. Subscribe to Castellum for more content on medieval castles, and please tell me if you enjoy this kind of video in the comments. I would greatly appreciate your feedback. I will see you soon.